The title of our lesson today is The Unveiling of Jerusalem, Part 1. Now, before we go through any of the diagrams and any of the verses, I just want to say that first thing that we need to know is, what is Jerusalem? And where is Jerusalem? And why do we need to know? Why do we need to know the meaning? Or why do we need to know the dichotomy of Jerusalem? Let's put it that way. First of all, let me just give you the simple definition of Jerusalem. From the beginning, God always intended for man to dwell with God. So Jerusalem is the place that God prepared. It is the place that is holy. It is the only one place where God intends to meet with man and to dwell with man while we are on earth. Which is why in the past, when I would always go back to Genesis and start teaching on the 7 days of creation, I always say the first 3 days, God prepared the place. And the next 3 days, God filled the place. And the seventh day was the Sabbath, where God only rested from his work of creation, which he was planning to continue or finish the work on the cross through the 7 last words, to finish the creation of the spiritual man. But with the unveiling of John chapter 14, verses 1 to 6, all of a sudden, we saw the progressive unveiling of the first 2 days of Genesis 1. From our lesson last week, we discovered that the first 2 days, God already started preparing the spiritual Jerusalem, the holy place where God would want to meet with man on earth. In the past, we thought we will only live with God when we die, when we go to heaven. But as we get to study the word closely, and the Lord opens the secret of his kingdom to us, we discover that on the first 3 days of creation, what took priority was the preparation of that spiritual tabernacle on earth where God could dwell. So it took him the first 2 days to prepare that spiritual dwelling, which would later on be, we will discover, would be Jerusalem, which is the holy place where God would dwell with man. It is only on the third day that God prepared the physical dwelling of man, which is the, and then the next 3 days of creation, which is the fourth day to the fifth day, God filled the earth. It would only be on the cross that after the third day of the spiritual dwelling place of God, that God could start to fill the spiritual dwelling of God on earth. It is only after Jesus was risen from the dead. Moving forward, we already know what the definition of Jerusalem is. It is the only one holy place that God has prepared since the foundation of the world, as early on as creation. A place that God prepared as God's dwelling place on earth. Because we know God cannot dwell in a temple made by man. Meaning, there's no way God can dwell in physical earth. Why? Because the ruler of the earth is Satan. So we know God is everywhere, but God cannot dwell on earth because earth belongs to the rulership of Satan, and the earth is in darkness. Okay, I hope that is made clear. So that's why day one of creation, God separated darkness and light. So we can already see, even now, as early as now, you can already know that when we get to understand the dichotomy of Jerusalem, there is a physical Jerusalem, which was the temple built by Solomon in physical, the land of Israel, and there is a spiritual Jerusalem, the one holy place that God has set from the beginning so that he can dwell there. And we discover that it could only be in the heart of man. But God cannot dwell in our hearts. That's just the way it is now. Man has to go through the journey that God has set. And besides, we are going to discover that the only place of worship is in Jerusalem, even as we saw in the past. Remember when God stipulated Jerusalem in Judah to be the only place in Israel where all the Israelites would go 3 times out of every year, marking the 3 main festivals. And we know that festival means appointment with God. These 3 main festivals compose 7 parts. It has 7 components. And we know those are all the 7 furnitures of the tabernacle. And now for us to know that we cannot worship God the best way we know how. In the past, we worship God the best way that I think is correct. But that's not acceptable to God. The only way we can worship God is to follow the way that He is stipulated in the book, because He gave specific instructions on how He wanted to be worshipped. And that worship can only take place in the spiritual Jerusalem that God prepared from the beginning of time. Now, for us to know the beginning of the instructions of God about setting up that one place, you open now your Bibles to Deuteronomy 12. And let's read. These are the statutes and the judgments which you shall be careful to observe in the land the Lord God of our fathers is giving you to possess all the days that you live on the earth. In that first verse, already showing us that God only intends one place, one land, where God is going to bring our patriarchs. And since God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, God brought our patriarchs to this land. And the relevance of this today is that God is still going to bring us this one land and one place where He wants us to worship. That the heading you see there, the heading of Deuteronomy 12 is a prescribed place worship. Then, if you read this, if you just read this, you will not know that's already preparing us to understand Jerusalem. But this is exactly where it is going to be done. Now, to be able to understand verse 1, first you have to understand what is the difference between statutes, judgment, and commandments. And these are the 3 words that I'll have to define to you so that you'll be able to understand. Now we know that God has sons of God and sons of man. Sons of God are the children of God. Sons of men are from the seed of Satan. The sons of God are from the capital letter S, the seed of God. And the sons of men are from the small letter S, the seed of Adam or the Satan. Okay? To everybody, God gave commandments to follow. But we know for certain, nobody, whether sons of God or sons of men, we cannot obey the commandments apart from us knowing the statutes and the judgment. So what does God mean when he says statutes? Statutes are the secret unveiled instructions that God gives to the sons of God so that they will be able to follow the commandments. We have to know the statutes of God. They are special instructions that would prepare man's heart to be able to obey the commandments. Because if you don't know the statutes of God and you don't know that, we have to follow God's judgments, no way can you be able to follow the commandments of God. So what are the statutes of God? So if you read the succeeding verses, those are the secret statutes that God would teach. We are going to be brought to the secret place where once we get there, that's the only time that we can worship. That's the only time that we can follow and obey the commandments. Okay? We are going to learn those statutes as we go through the following succeeding verses. Now, it is not only the statutes that we need to know. There is no way we can come to the place of worship until man goes through judgment. Why? Because God is holy. And before you can even approach God, because of man's sin, God is love, but yet God is just, so that we all have to go through judgment. What is the judgment that all men are destined to? We are all destined to receive our judgment in the eternal lake of fire. But to God's chosen, He's going to give the statutes to give us the secret where, if we obey these statutes, we are going to be spared the judgment in the eternal lake of fire, because God is going to bring us to the lesser judgment of the judgment above, which is in the first heaven of tabernacle number 4. Why? Because it is the Trinity. The Trinity is the one going to take our place in the heavier judgment below. And that is why the succeeding verses are very important. So before we can even cross over to the holy place of God, we have to go through judgment. Okay? So now you know the difference. Statutes are the special instructions God gives to His children that we should follow, so that instead of having the greater judgment in hell, we are going to have the lesser judgment in tabernacle number 4 on the first heaven. Because we cannot approach God for worship unless we go through judgment first. Then after our judgment, that's the only time we can obey the law. Because then God is already indwelt in our hearts. So it is now the Trinity who are indwelt in our hearts. They will be the ones to fulfill the law. So just by understanding the statutes, the judgments, and the commandments, we already have learned a lot. So now let's continue reading. Let me read again verse 1. These are the statutes and the judgments which you shall be careful to observe in the land which the Lord God of your fathers is giving you to possess all the days that you live on earth. So you see, it says there, all the days that you live on earth, meaning while we are still on earth, God is already going to give us, or He's already going to bring us to the land that He has prepared on the first 2 days of creation, so that God can live with us on earth. Okay, let's go to verse 2. You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations which you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains, on the hills, and under every green tree. What is this talking about? As early as verse 2, God is already telling us, you cannot go to the land. You cannot worship me if you are still worshiping other gods in the high mountains. We saw the picture where, remember the chosen people, God led them out of Egypt. And then when they came to the promised land, he says, the promised land or Canaan was inhabited by the Sevenites. The Sevenites had different idols. They worshiped in the high places. They had Baal, they had different gods. All of those are a picture of the idols that we have let inside our hearts, that we are worshiping, that we are idolizing. They are the competition. They are God's competitors in the rightful ownership of our hearts. So that's the first thing God is going to destroy. He says, you shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations which you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills, on every green tree. Where it is mentioning the high mountains, because God's tabernacle is on the mountain. Okay, that's where God's mountain is. It's above. It's not on earth. So now you understand verse 2. And then verse 3, it says, and you shall destroy their altars, break their sacred pillars, and burn their wooden idols with fire. You shall cut down the carved images of their gods and destroy their names from that place. You shall not worship the Lord your God with such things. Meaning very clear in verse 4, we cannot worship God if there are still idols in our hearts. That is why we're going through afflictions. That is why we're going through earthquakes. Because God is shaking all the altars that we have set in our hearts. Here it is pictured as the altars in the high places. Because the high places is where God lives. And that's our hearts, when it comes to the promised land, is going to be set in heaven. That's why we saw the picture when God says, God created the heavens and the earth. The heavens were above the earth. That is why it is called a high place. It is not on earth. Very clear again, verse 4. You shall not worship the Lord your God with such things. Let's go to verse 5. But you shall seek the place where the Lord your God chooses out of your tribes to put his name for his dwelling place. There you shall go. Now, for the place where God is going to bring us to worship, you will know that it is his place because he's going to put his name there. As we go to the progressive unveiling of the word, he's going to give more details as we move forward in our reading the word. He says, there you shall take your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, and heave offerings of your hand, your vowed offerings, your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and your flock. What is this talking about? It is talking about the burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, your heave offerings. Let me explain each verse. When he says, there you shall take your burnt offering, in the Old Testament, the burnt offerings are looking forward to the offering that God is going to give us when he gives us the Lamb of God. Jesus, who came from heaven, is going to be God's burnt offering on Calvary to take the place of our judgment below. So you see, these are statutes that are hidden only to those whom God is going to call to be his sons and bride. He is going to give us an alternative. Instead of me burning in hell, he is going to provide me. In the Old Testament, it was the lamb or all the clean animals that they had to offer in the place that God would specify. Forward looking to later on, that would be in Jerusalem alone. Okay. And then it says there, seek the place where the Lord of God chooses out of all the tribes. Later on, it will tell you that it's from the tribe of Judah, because pointing to Jesus, who will change the priesthood from the Levites to the priesthood of Jesus who came from the tribe of Levi. I'm doing a fast forward, but that's where it's gonna lead us. Anyway, it says here, that is where you are going to take your tithes. In the Old Testament, when they had to go to Jerusalem, and if the trip from where they live is a far distance to Jerusalem, instead of them bringing the lamb for them to take that long journey to Jerusalem, they will just bring silver. And then they will just buy the lamb when they get to Jerusalem. That's why their tithes in the Old Testament was silver, for them to buy the lamb once they get to Jerusalem to offer as a sacrifice. Today, the relevance of this to us is when I am now brought to the tabernacle of God, God will no longer require silver. The tithe that God would require for me to be able to worship Him in the spiritual Jerusalem is my heart. So what am I going to offer God? When God is bringing me through affliction and is shaking my heart, my surrender will be, okay, Lord, I give you all of my heart. Go ahead and shake everything that could be shaken. Voluntarily, I lay down my heart so that you can prepare it as your dwelling place. What is this heave offering? The heave offering is the product of the threshing floor when you go to furniture number 4, which is the table of showbread. That's the heave offering. Heave offering is the product of the threshing floor. Ano yung threshing floor? The threshing floor is where they bring the grain and then you pound the grain to separate the chaff from the wheat. So that is what you're going to offer the Lord. Why? Because your heart is going to go through pounding. It's going to go through pounding like the grain that's being pounded so that the chaff will be separated from the wheat. Your hearts, when you give them, when you offer them to God as your tithe, God is going to pound your heart so that the outer covering or the outer seed, so that the seed from Adam will die. Do you see the picture? That is the picture of the statutes that God is giving you and me. So that if we are able to understand this, we will be willing to give our hearts when He brings me through the threshing, through the pounding, through the shaking, and the earthquakes of my life. Okay, now He says, there you shall take your burnt offering, your sacrifices, your tithes, and heave offerings of your hand, your vowed offerings, your free will offerings. See, it has to be willingly, because when Jesus offered Himself as the burnt offering on the cross, He gave of Himself willingly. He was not forced to do it. That's why when the soldiers came to Him on the evening after He left the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter wanted to stop them. Peter even cut the ear of one of the soldiers, but Jesus says, no, don't stop them. He says, I am the one you are looking for. He offered Himself willingly. He didn't hide, He gave of Himself willingly because He knew, as soon as Jesus was born, He knew He was destined to die for you and me. So God is also waiting for you to be willing to give of your heart, to lay down your life so that you can join Jesus outside the camp, to be able to transfer to this place that He has prepared for us. The firstborn of your flocks and your herd. Of course, we already know the firstborn. The firstborn is the firstborn of the lamb without blemish, forward looking to Jesus, who was the firstborn of all creation. Because on Jesus' resurrection, He was the first man that ever lived, the very firstborn of God, who was created with a spiritual heart to obey God, to follow God's will. Jesus was the firstborn of all creation. So when we follow him to the ground and lay down our lives, we are risen, a new creation. We become God's firstborn. But Jesus is the eldest of all of God's firstborn. He was the very firstborn. And then verse 7, and there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice in all to which you have put your hand, you and your household, in which the Lord your God has blessed you. So you see, God is saying, once you have come to this land, the tabernacle of God, he says that is where you are going to eat before God. What does God mean when he says you are going to eat? On earth, we eat physical bread. When we get to the land that God has prepared, we are going to eat spiritual food. What is that? It is the food that comes from the tree of life that Adam and Eve could not eat then when they were in the Garden of Eden. They ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil or all the other trees that grew from the ground. They were not eating from the tree of life. We can only eat from the tree of life once we have transferred to the land that God has given us. What does that mean? We are eating God's food when we read the word, and the scriptures become open. Meaning, pagbukas ko ng Bible, pagbasa ko, personal si God nangungusap sa akin. Yung understanding ko, buhay. Buhay na buhay si Lord nangungusap sa akin, hindi yung nakatago lahat ng meaning. Actually, what I read for you from verse 1 up to verse 7, it is the open word. It is God opening the book to each and every one of us. Before, we did not know the difference between statutes, between judgment, between commandments. We didn't know the difference. Now we know. What we are reading are the statutes, the hidden instructions, so that the bride could be saved from the judgment of eternal lake of fire below. Let's continue, verse 8. You shall not at all do as we are doing here today. Every man doing what is right in his own eyes. For as yet you have not come to the rest and the inheritance which the Lord your God is giving you. Here, very clear. You cannot worship God by doing whatever is right in your own eyes. Later, we are going to see why Abel's offering was accepted, because Abel followed the statutes of God. He offered the firstborn of a lamb. Cain offered what he thought was best. In reality, he offered the best produce of the land because he was a farmer. But it was not acceptable to God. Why? Because it was not according to the statutes that God has given. Do you see the difference? Even if you do your best, you worship God, sabi mo, oh Lord, mataimtim talagang sa buong puso ko, nagpipray ako sa iyo, bukal sa puso ko. It's still not enough. You have to know God's statutes. You have to go through God's judgment to be able to enter God's house. Now let's go to the next. Verse 10. But when you cross over the Jordan and dwell in the land, see, the land is crossing the Jordan. First, we see after they left Egypt, they crossed the Red Sea. Red Sea is parallel to the first heaven, where they had to go through judgment. After judgment, they can now enter the promised land, where they had to cross the River Jordan. The River Jordan is parallel to transferring from the waters below, where you go through judgment in the waters below, you transfer to the waters above. That is crossing the River Jordan. Crossing the Red Sea is judgment. Crossing the River Jordan is transferring from the waters below to the waters above. That's why you see the rivers, the water stood up as a wall when they crossed the river Jordan. And the Ark of the Covenant was going before them, meaning God's presence was there before them. That's the Ark of the Covenant. And then it says, but when you cross over the Jordan and dwell in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and he gives you rest from all your enemies round about, so that you dwell in safety. Okay, what is rest? Rest, the first rest was achieved on the day of the Sabbath. The first rest was the seventh day of creation. God only rested from his work of physical creation. On the 14th day, which is the second seven after Jesus died, it says that the next day was the Sabbath. That is the true rest that God has now prepared for us because Jesus has now died. Giving us a picture that to come to rest is to die. Parallel to your death and my death will be the beginning of our rest. Because until we die, there is war in our hearts. The war is between God and man. When we are in sin, we are in enmity with God. Hindi tayo bati ni God. Kaya nga, there is no rest. Ang puso mo walang peace. Magkakaroon lang yan ng peace pag nakipagbati ka na uli kay God. So while you are not in speaking terms with God, there is no rest. Kaya tingnan mo, most everybody, their hearts are restless. They don't have peace. What they don't know is that their hearts are not yet God's tabernacle. Kaunting problema, nayayanig. Kaunting sakit, nayayanig. Kasi yung puso hindi pa tabernacle ni God eh. So that is rest. Ano sabi niya? Rest from all your enemies. So, when my heart has not come to rest, my enemy is God. After my heart has gone through death, I am now at peace with God. Ang enemy ko na ngayon, si Satan. But when Satan now becomes my enemy, I am now at rest. Why? Kasi hindi na ako ang lalaban kay Satan. Ang lalaban kay Satan, ang Trinity na. Okay, I now come to rest. Grabe ang meaning nito, and we're only here in the statutes of Deuteronomy 12. And there's more God is going to unveil to us. Okay, let's continue. And then there will be the place where the Lord your God chooses to make his name abide. When your heart has been made God's tabernacle, he will even give you a new name. He will give you God's name once you have come to tabernacle 4, furniture number 3, because that is where you are truly born again. That is when you are born again, not when you say, Lord, I accept you into my heart, born again ka na. Impossible. Kasi yung heart ko, flesh pa eh. It has to go through a transformation. It has to go through the process that God has stipulated as I learn his statutes. Let's continue. There you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices. See, pag inulit ni Lord, very important yan. Your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, and heave offerings of your hand. Of course, then, it was just the physical silver, it was the physical lamb, it was the physical heave offerings, the product of the threshing floor. But sa atin, ang relevance nito, yung nga sinabi ko na kanina, ang puso natin ang tithes. Ang offering natin si Jesus, na siya yung unang lamb na inoffer para yung puso ko malinisan. Now I can offer my heart. After Jesus has offered his heart to cleanse my heart, I can now offer my heart to be demolished. Kasi it can now be risen from the dead kasi bayad na yung sin. But until Jesus offered his heart as a sacrifice, I cannot yet offer my heart because it's loaded with sin. And if I offer it and die, I will not be risen. Kasi yung hindi ako pakakawalan ni Satan because when my heart is in sin, I am under bondage to Satan in the world. Okay? Verse 12. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God you and your sons and your daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levite who is within your gates, since he has no portion nor inheritance with you. Okay, there were 12 tribes, children of Jacob. Out of the 12 tribes, one, which is the line of Levi, was God's representative to be priests. They were the only ones who can do the work inside God's tabernacle. The remainder of the 11 tribes, they were only outside. Only the Levites can go in. When they got to the promised land, the whole land of Canaan was divided into 11. Only among the 11 tribes, the Levites did not have a portion. But what did God say? Your portion is my portion. Why? Because all of the 11 tribes offered the best of their produce as tithes. Yun ang kanilang tithes that were offered in the temple. And all of those tithes, God said, all of this that were offered to me, I give to you as your inheritance. So in other words, God is saying, my portion I give to you. Can you imagine? What does that mean? I don't own anything on earth. The picture is I don't own anything on earth. But everything that is God's, He gives to me. Can you imagine that exchange? When you become God's priests, because when we are the bride after Jesus' crucifixion, all of us now can be priests when Jesus is the high priest. So that is the reason why the bride can now go inside the tabernacle number 4. In the Old Testament, nobody can go inside the tabernacle except the priest, and the high priest, forward looking to Jesus, is the only one who can go inside the most holy place. Okay? But today, the relevance is because Jesus has already finished building tabernacle 4. When we go join him outside the camp, the first camp and the second camp, we can now go inside the tabernacle of God and become the priests and kings. That's what it means. Okay, verse 13. It says, take heed to yourself that you do not offer your burnt offerings in every place that you see. Meaning, we cannot worship anywhere. Now, it used to be, we thought, oh, you can worship anywhere because God is everywhere. But now, knowing Deuteronomy 12, what is it telling us? You cannot worship just anywhere. You have to have an altar in your heart. You have to have God's altar established in your heart. That's why for the next lessons, I'm going to go through the progressive unveiling of how God progressively revealed the altars that he would accept. Okay? Let me finish reading. It says, but he says, take heed to yourself that you do not offer your burnt offerings in every place that you see, but in the place which the Lord God chooses, in one of your tribes, meaning he will only accept the place which he would choose in one of your tribes, meaning the tribe of Judah, because that will be the tribe where Jesus would come from. He is going to be the one to prepare the place where you and I can get in, which is God's tabernacle. He says, in one of your tribes, there you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I command you. So dito pa lang niya pinasok yung command, meaning he already gave me his statutes from verse 1 to 14. He already gave me a picture of judgment because it is the burnt offering forward looking to the Lamb of God who was going to take my place in my judgment below for me to get the lesser judgment. Okay? So that's the judgment I have to go through before I can get in that land. And now he says, there you shall do all that I command you. So it's only after I know the statutes, I have been through my lesser judgment, that I can now obey the commandments of God. Ito pa lang Deuteronomy 12, verses 1 to 14, we already learned a lot. And this is only a preview of what God has yet to unveil to us, what He has yet to reveal to us, to build that tabernacle or that altar in your heart and mind, the only true place where we could worship according to what God would say, not according to what I think is best. Because what I think is best is not good enough for God. So I hope Deuteronomy 12 has become clear to you. These are the statutes, and we have learned of God's judgment. Then we can obey the commands. So these statutes and commands must be very important. But because the statutes, the judgment, and the commands are very important, God would repeat them over and over and over. So the first one is Deuteronomy 1 to 21. The next one is Deuteronomy 4, verses 1 to 24. It will tell you about Moses' commands for obedience and beware of idolatry. But it will always repeat the statutes, the judgments, and the commandments. And then go to Deuteronomy chapter 7, you read verses 1 to 7. And then you read Deuteronomy 30, verses 15 to 16. Okay, study all of those for yourselves, okay, so that we can move forward. I said God would reveal to us the 5 altars that were acceptable to Him. We know that only the bride has a covenant with God. So the altars that God would give the secret to would be only to the bride who had a covenant with Him, even in the Old Testament. Our Old Testament patriarchs, God had 5 Old Testament covenants. Okay? All of them would become bride, even if they lived before the cross. Because God would reveal to them the altar where He wanted to be worshipped. So starting from Adam, after he fell, look at the goodness and the mercy of God. Even with starting with Adam, God began to give the statutes that He wanted. And how did He state it? Through the covenants. Because embedded in the covenants are the secret statutes where God could reveal to them the way to be able to set up the altar. First of all, I forgot to say that when after Adam and Eve sinned, God and man were not in speaking terms. So because of God's mercy and love, there was no way man could get out of the earth to go to heaven. Even with all the good works that we do, man cannot go up. Man can only go down to hell, but man cannot go up to heaven. So what did God do? God was the one who stooped down and went to earth and gave His covenants. That is why the first covenant was given to Eve. Normally, you see, even when Adam and Eve were in the garden, God never talked to Eve. Why? Because Eve's heart was still flesh. But when God's mercy began, He started talking to Eve through the covenants. Why? Because hidden in the covenants was Jesus, who would pay for the sins of Adam, who would pay for the judgment of Adam and Eve and all his descendants who would have covenants with Him. He would pay for the judgment. Jesus was promised to pay for the judgment of all of our patriarchs so that they could be reconciled with God. Kung hindi sila magbabate. So, pwede lang silang magbate if they join the covenants. Okay? The first altar that God revealed, the first altar where God would now start to talk with our patriarchs starting from Adam, was through the offering that Abel offered to God. Okay, let's read Genesis 4, verses 1 to 5. This was the first offering. This was the first altar that was set up by Abel for us to see that the only way that they can talk to God was by setting up this altar. We see that Abel was able to talk to God because he followed the statutes. Cain also offered his offering, but he could not talk to God. Why? Because he did not follow the statutes that we read a while ago in Deuteronomy 12. Okay, let's start reading verse 1. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and he conceived and bore Cain and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. And then she bore again this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. First of all, let me define keywords. Let me first define, what does it mean when it says here, Abel was a keeper of sheep? What is the meaning of keeper of sheep? For us to see the relevance of this in our time today, first of all, who is the keeper of sheep? The keeper of sheep is Jesus, because he would say in John chapter 10,
Shepherd.
I am, and of course, the shepherd has sheep. Okay, I'm going to go through all of that when we go through John 10. But what we see is that Abel was a type of Jesus, because it says there, he was a keeper of sheep. Nakikita mo, historical lang eh. But it has a deeper meaning, which is even relevant to us today. First of all, before you can be a keeper of sheep, you have to be a sheep. Jesus will say, I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. My sheep know my voice, and they follow me. Follow him where? Jesus, we are going to see in John 10, Jesus laid down his life. When you are a sheep hearing God's voice, he says, my sheep, they know my voice, and they follow me. Where do we follow him? We have to follow him outside the camp and meet, because that's the only first place where we can meet with Jesus is outside the camp. We have to lay down our lives as well, but I'm moving forward. But that's just letting us know that to be a keeper of sheep, we have to first be a true sheep, meaning we have to have Jesus as our true shepherd. And then after I become a sheep, God will, after God has done with my heart and has brought me to the land where he's going to bring me, I can now be a keeper of sheep, meaning I can now be a light bearer that God could use to bring other sheep to Jesus. Okay? That is the meaning of keeper of sheep. So that is the status of Abel. And we see that as a keeper of sheep, what did Cain do? Cain killed Abel. Same way with Jesus. Cain is a picture of all of us. All of us killed Jesus, who was the keeper of sheep. Okay? In the same way that Cain killed Abel. But it's only for us to see a picture that Cain killed Abel. See, Abel was the good seed. God replaced Abel with Seth, so that all the sons of God will come from Seth all the way to where Jesus would come from. Jesus came from the Seth. Noah came from Seth, and then God destroyed all of the earth. And then through Noah, through Shem, trace it all the way down. That's where Jesus came from when he was born of the flesh, okay? So anyway, now let's go to the next verse. It says, Cain was the tiller of the ground. What does it mean when it says tiller of the ground? If you recall our lesson last week, after Adam sinned, the ground of the earth was cursed. Adam was thrown out of the Garden of Eden, and he said, he brought him to earth. He says, cursed is the ground from which you came from. And so I will send you back to earth to be the tiller of the ground, and you will till the ground with the sweat of your brow. So what does it mean to be a tiller of the ground? It means we are still carrying the curse of Adam. See, just from that verse, it's already telling us a big story. If you know what the keeper of the sheep means, and Cain was the tiller of the ground. You see that Abel was a type of Jesus. He was light bearer, whereas Cain carried the curse of his father Adam. Verse 3, in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. See, Cain offered his very best. He offered what he thought was the best, and true enough, it was the best produce of his land. You know, he only gave the best. But then what does it say here? Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering. Why did God respect the offering of Abel? Because it was following the statutes that we have read a while ago, that we have to offer the firstborn of the flock, meaning looking forward to Jesus, who will be the firstborn of God, born without sin, who will be offered by God himself to pay for the penalty of our sins. So when Abel offered the firstborn of the flock, he means he was in covenant with God, because it fulfilled the first covenant. What was the first covenant? Meaning, when God gave the first covenant to Eve or Adam must have taught it to his children. Eve must have given the first covenant was the statutes God gave. He must have taught it to Abel. That's why Abel followed the statutes and he offered the correct offering. Well, let me just finish reading this. And it says, God respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 19 says, but you were purchased with the precious blood of Christ, the Messiah, like that of a sacrificial lamb without blemish or spot. So you see, by Abel offering the firstborn of a lamb, it is parallel to Jesus's having purchased us with his precious blood. That is how relevant that offering of Abel was to us today, because it was forward-looking to the blood offering that God gave on the cross for man. The first covenant had three components. It says in Genesis 3:15, for God to be reconciled with man, para magbabati na si God at si man. That's why God was able to talk to Eve, because of this covenant. It says here, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. This covenant is the promise of Jesus. Pag binasa mo lang with logos, you will never see the three components. Neither will you understand the meaning of it. But with God opening scriptures to us, we see that the first component, which is I will put enmity between you and the woman, meaning God and man were not in speaking terms. Hindi sila bate. So with the promise of the covenant, God was going to transfer the enmity between God and man. Ililipat niya between man and Satan. So ililipat niya. Si Satan na ngayon ang magiging kagalit natin, si God yung ating ng kabate. And then the second component was, I will put enmity between your seed and her seed. Ang magkalaban, the sons of God and the sons of men. Because the sons of God had now the seed of God, and the sons of man have the seed of Satan. So sila ngayon ang mag-aaway, flesh to flesh. Okay? And then the third component is, he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. What is this telling us? That it is God who is going to crush the head of Satan. He talking about Jesus. He talking about the capital letter S, Jesus, who was promised to Eve as the one who will transfer the anger of God from his anger between man and God. Malilipat na yung anger between Satan and man. Okay? How can this be? Because of the promised seed, where God is going to crush the head of Satan. Where would this be? Of course, this would only be possible on the cross. Now, that is the first covenant. But how is it relevant to us today? It was relevant to Abraham when God would now give the third covenant to Abraham, when God said, leave your country, leave your people, leave your father's household. You see the consistency of scripture? It is still relevant to our journey today. After the unveiling of John 14, verses 1 to 6, we see the parallel of the components of the first covenant to our journey today. When God said to Abraham, leave your country, it is parallel to woman or man being in enmity with Satan, meaning ang enemy mo na si Satan. When will Satan be your enemy? You have to leave the earth. Okay? So earth is tabernacle number 2, where we are under bondage to Satan. We can only leave the earth because of tabernacle 3, when God provided the way for us to cross over from Egypt or from the earth to tabernacle 4. So what happens? Leave your country is parallel to the first component of the first covenant, where we can now exit the earth, join Jesus outside the camp. Where? On the altar of incense below, where after Jesus' heart was pierced, I will join Jesus. When I offer my heart now to be pierced as I go through my affliction, I give my tithe to the Lord and say, Lord, okay, go ahead. I give you my whole heart. Go ahead and pierce it until all the blood is out, because the blood is sinful blood, and that blood is the one going to burn in hell. But I am not, because my heart was pierced. It will be Jesus who will be the one to burn in the greater judgment below, because Jesus will not stay there more than 3 days. Because Jesus's heart was spiritual, he can only stay in the ground 3 days. He will be risen after 3 days. Okay, only Jesus can do that. That's why he was the firstborn on earth of all creation. So that is parallel to leave your country, leave your family. The second component was sons of God against the sons of man, meaning for God to be able to dwell in my heart, I should not have any sons of man in my heart. No created things, no created things, no created people, no nothing in my heart. Meaning my heart has to be completely shaken of everything. So that is what it means by leave your family. That is the second instruction to Abraham. It is still relevant to us today, because from my being in the first camp, outside the camp, in the altar of incense below tabernacle 3, God can now make me transfer. I can now enter tabernacle 4, where I will get my lesser judgment in the first heaven. Why can I now leave the earth? Because here in the altar of incense below, my heart has been cleansed. After I join Jesus in death, I now obtain his mercy. I have now peace with God. I am now justified. I now have the righteousness of God. When in Galatians 2:20, I join Jesus in death, so that I am risen and new creation. I can now enter God's tabernacle. Remember I said a while ago, God's statutes, those are the hidden instructions. God's judgment is, I have to go through judgment before I can enter God's house. So here I get my judgment in the first heaven, so that now, for the third component, I can enter God's house. The third component is leave your father's household. What does that mean? I now leave my connection with Adam's house, meaning I no longer belong to the seed of Adam. I now belong to the seed, capital letter S, of Jesus, because my heart has now gone through. First, I already met Jesus outside the camp for my heart to be cleansed of sin. I now go to my second camp, outside the camp, first heaven, where my heart that is from the seed of Adam will be burned. So that now, after the burning, And the washing in the brazen altar, those are judgment, because this is brass. Brass, brazen altar is judgment. Brazen laver is judgment. I complete my judgment. I can now exit the first heaven to enter the holy place. I now go to the candlestick where I am born again. That is what it means, where God is now the enemy of Satan, meaning God has now crushed the head of Satan. The rulership of Satan in my heart is completely finished, together with the demolishing of my heart. Satan no longer has dominion over me, but it is God now who has complete dominion over my heart. So that now God has given me a new intellect, because the word of God is in my mind and my heart. A new will, because now I do not do my will, I do not do my way, I only follow his way, and I only follow God's will. Exactly a picture of how Jesus lived on earth. And then even my emotions do not go up and down. That is why Paul says, in all circumstances, I rejoice. Because you are certain you are in God's hands. No matter what shaking you go through. Like what Kate said a while ago, this world is going to go through shaking, this whole world, because God is fast tracking the bride. This world is going to go through shaking, but you are not going to be disturbed. Why? Because you are completely hidden in a shelter, nuclear shelter that is beyond the reach of the enemy. You are in safe ground in tabernacle number 4. Okay, now that is the first altar that God allowed Abel to set up. That is the only place where God is going to talk to him when he brings his offering. That's the only way that he can talk to God, is via that altar that Abel set up. When he offers the burnt offering, it met the 3 requirements of a covenant. There was the shedding of the blood. He transferred to a new house, you see. You transferred to a new house when you leave your country. He transferred to a new house, and he transferred to a new seed. He fulfilled all the 3 requirements of the covenant. That is why Abel and all of those like him who will offer the same offering, following God's statutes, will make it to become a bride. So now let's go to Hebrews chapter 9. Hebrews chapter 9 verse 27 and 28 says, as it is appointed for man to die once, but after this the judgment. So Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time, apart from sin, for salvation. If you just read that with cerebral mind and logos, you don't even understand this. But when God opens our spiritual eyes and ears, he will open this so that you understand. From the beginning, even when God created the 7 days of creation, he appointed the bride to die once. As long as the bride follows his statutes, he follows the judgment and his commands. The bride is only going to die once. He's going to be born twice. The bride was born when he was born from the seed of Adam. He's going to die once where? You're going to die once here. When you first meet with Jesus in the below tabernacle number 3, that is where you're going to die once. Okay? Meaning my heart was pierced. That's my death to the flesh. Galatians 2:20. Below tabernacle number 3. After I die, I go through my judgment sa tabernacle number 4 in the first heaven. Okay? This is the first heaven. That's where I have my judgment. Why can I do this? Because Christ was offered once on the cross to bear the sins of many. When Jesus died on the cross and his heart was pierced, he bore my sins so that when his heart was pierced, blood came out of his heart, cleansed the ground. When I join him on the ground to have my heart pierced, my heart is cleansed. That is what it means when it says, it was appointed for man to die once. Okay, it's because Jesus died on the cross. Now, if I never went out of the earth and I never joined Jesus in death, meaning, oh, I did not die to the flesh, I just said, Lord, I accept you into my heart. Do you think I'm gonna go through, I can go enter the tabernacle for my judgment? No, I'm gonna go down to the bottom of the earth to get my judgment in hell, because I never joined Jesus in death in below tabernacle number 3. That is very clear, because only those who eagerly await for him to appear a second time. Okay, after I joined Jesus in death in below tabernacle number 3, I go to tabernacle 4 to get my judgment. That is where Jesus will appear a second time. Remember, he said, after I am risen, wait for me in Galilee, which is first heaven, because Jesus is going to join me when I burn here in the brazen altar above. That is my judgment before I can enter the holy place. He says, he will appear a second time. Okay, what is time? I already explained time many times. For Jesus, the time of, when Jesus says, my time has not yet come, meaning Jesus' death has not yet come. And the time is Jesus' death and his resurrection. Time has two components, death and resurrection. Okay, for me and you to be able to join Jesus in resurrection for a new life, we also have to go through our time. Our first time is joining him in his death here. And the second time is to join him in the brazen altar for my judgment. It's no longer from sin, because when I go to the enter tabernacle number 4, I no longer have any sin. My sins have been washed below on the tabernacle, underneath tabernacle number 3, on the altar of incense. My heart has been washed and cleansed. So it says here, he will appear a second time, meaning I will meet Jesus on his resurrection in the brazen altar. This is now for my salvation. So my salvation only happens after I am done with judgment in the first 7. I entered the holy place in tabernacle number 4. Then I can say I am saved. I am born again. I will never die again. Okay? So how many times do I die? I only die once. But how many times am I born? I am born 2 times, because I was born from my mother when I was born, when I was a baby, and I'm going to be born again in tabernacle number 4 in the candlestick. That's my second birth. That's the true born again. Okay, now let's go to Matthew 23, verses 37 to 39. Jesus laments over Jerusalem. Now you have an idea what Jerusalem is all about. There is a physical Jerusalem. You are going to know more as we move forward, okay? But here I just want to say that there is a physical Jerusalem and there's a spiritual Jerusalem where the Lord is going to bring us. That is the place that he promised that he's going to bring the bride. Now, what does it say here? You can find this same thing. This is in Matthew 23, verses 37 to 39. It's the same in Luke chapter 13, verses 34 to 35. And let's read. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Now, which Jerusalem is Jesus talking about? It is the physical Jerusalem that is in Israel, okay? Before Jesus died, the temple that Solomon built was demolished during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, but it was rebuilt during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and King Herod rebuilt the tabernacle. Picture of the rebuilt tabernacle is the rebuilt tabernacle of our heart, which is the spiritual tabernacle. But it was still a physical tabernacle in Jerusalem, okay? So he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, he says, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. Do you know that all who still worship in the physical Jerusalem will kill the prophets? In other words, those who are still in the Logos will kill the light bearers who are already teaching the unveiled word. The people who are still in the Logos will kill, will persecute you know, they are going to be instruments of God to afflict the light bearers. That is true even up to today. Very clear there. Mamaya, dadaling ko kayo sa John 16. Papakita ni Jesus doon, binawarn niya, na when you get to know me, when you get to teach my word, he says, they will throw you out of the church. They will throw you out of the synagogue. They will throw you out of where your church belongs because they will no longer understand your teaching because you are teaching spiritual things. Okay? Very clear dyan yan. Ha? So you have to already be prepared. When you become a light bearer, you're going to be thrown out of your church. You are going to be killed. When people think that they kill you, they're doing God a favor because they think you are doing blasphemy, you are teaching cult, you are from the wrong religion. That's what this Bible is telling us. Sabi niya, oh Jerusalem, Jerusalem. This is the physical Jerusalem. Sabi niya, those who kills the prophets are the light bearers in the Old Testament, parallel to light bearers today, and stone those who are sent to hell. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. And I say to you, you shall see me no more until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Meaning, all of those who are still staying in the physical Jerusalem, after Jesus dies, they will not see Jesus anymore. They will keep reading the Bible will be closed. Until one day, when these light bearers will be able to bring them back to Jesus, so that then they will say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. What does that mean? That is the unveiling. In Hebrew, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord is Barak Habab Bashem Adonai. When you say Baruch Habab Bashem Adonai, meaning blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, when your spiritual eyes get to see the unveiling of the word, when a light bearer is used by God to bring you to the unveiling of the word, that is the only time that you're going to see Jesus once again. Through the word that is going to be made open. Okay? So now let's read Matthew 24 verses 1 to 4. What is the heading of Matthew 24? The heading is Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. I want to end with this verse. This is very, very, very important because many people teach this verse and they miss it because they do not understand Jerusalem. Specific, God says there, what's the heading? Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. Okay, and so let's begin with verse 1. And then Jesus went out and departed from the temple. What is this temple? This is the physical Jerusalem, okay? And his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple, meaning the physical building of the temple of Jerusalem that originally was built by Solomon, restored by Ezra and Nehemiah, and King Herod. And then Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone will be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. What was he talking about? He was talking about that physical temple. And he was also talking about his body, the body of Jesus, which is the church, the bride. So you will see, he pointing to the physical Jerusalem, na sinasabi niya, this physical Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. Not one stone will be left. What is that picture of? It's the demolishing of your heart and mind. It is also the picture of Jesus dying on the cross. When Jesus died on the cross, he says, destroy this temple. John chapter 2. I forgot which verse. You just look it up, where Jesus cleansed the temple and he said, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. He was talking about the physical temple. He was talking about his body that was going to be destroyed when he died on the cross. But he said, in 3 days, I will raise it up. That's why he was risen in 3 days. In the physical, ito na baliktad. Dito, sabi niya, destroy this temple and in 3 days, I will raise it up. It is the spiritual temple. See, in the physical, it was the physical Jerusalem that was destroyed when the Babylonians destroyed the Temple of Solomon. But I should have brought you there in Jeremiah, the last chapter of Jeremiah, when King Zedekiah was king, the whole of the Temple of Solomon was demolished. They carted everything, all the precious metals, to Babylon. But so the physical temple was demolished first. But here when Jesus comes, makikita mo, ang unang i-demolish yung spiritual na baliktad. Ang unang dinemolish yung body ni Jesus. When Jesus said, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up, the physical temple was only destroyed after 70 years. The physical temple that he was pointing, he says, not one stone will be left upon another, that this temple will be destroyed. He was talking about the temple, the heart of the bride. After Jesus' death, the physical heart of the bride, your heart and mine, can now be demolished. And in 3 days, those are the 3 main festivals. And we now enter the tabernacle, when we enter the tabernacle number 4. That is the rebuilding of the spiritual house of God. That is the spiritual Jerusalem on earth, where God is going to rebuild his house in my heart. That is what he meant there. Okay? Yan ang ibig sabihin, not one stone will be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. If you are in the Logos, you're only talking about the physical Jerusalem. Do you know that up to now, after 70 years, the physical tabernacle was demolished? Up to now, in Jerusalem, the temple is still destroyed. So, if you are still worshiping in the physical Jerusalem, it's not God you are worshiping. You are worshiping Satan. Until your heart is completely demolished and Jesus has rebuilt tabernacle number 4 in your heart, you cannot worship God. You're worshiping Satan. Kaya just listen to your prayers. When you now go through problems and you pray for the solution of your problem, you are praying in physical Jerusalem. When God is demolishing your tabernacle and you say, Lord, thank you, you are now starting to rebuild. You are preparing for the rebuilding of your tabernacle in my heart. Then God is going to set up his altar in your heart. Now let me go to verse 3. Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Do you know that there are 2 questions here? The question is the sign of your coming and the end of the age. Those are 2 entirely different things. If you go to a physical church, they will just think this is just one. They are going to say, oh, this is talking about the end times. You know, all of the signs that you are saying now, all the current events, they're all pointing that the end of the age is coming. But that's not true. When Jesus says, when they were asking, what will be the sign of your coming? See, after the spiritual temple, the physical, after the destruction of the physical temple, which is my heart, the coming here is when now Jesus comes into my heart. That's what we saw in Hebrews chapter 9. When Jesus appears the second time. When I have joined him the second time, joining him in his death and joining him in his resurrection, joining him when Jesus now joins me in my judgment in the first heaven, Jesus is now going to come inside my heart. That is this coming here. Hindi yung coming na pagdating na ni Lord at the end of the age. Itong the end of the age is another time. So the first coming was fulfilled in John chapter 14, verses 1 to 6, when Jesus says, okay, he says, I am now going to die. Do not let your hearts be troubled anymore. Because if I go and I will prepare a place for you. Meaning I am going to die and prepare tabernacle number 4 to you. And if I go and prepare tabernacle for you, I am coming again. So this is his coming. I am coming again and I'll take you to myself. This is the coming that this thing is talking about when he says, what is the sign of your coming? The sign of the coming of Jesus in your heart and mind is that not one stone will be left in your heart upon another. Yan yung affliction na dinadaanan natin. Kaya nga magpasalamat tayo. Dahil niyayanig. Kasi gusto niya walang ni isang bato maiiwan sa puso mo. Para ganun, makapasok na siya. Okay? And then sabi niya, what is the sign of the end of the age? When is the end of the age? There are two things. I think I'll just go to that next week. The end of the age is the judgment at the end of the age. We'll go to that in a later lesson. But I just wanted to show you the meaning of Matthew chapter 24, verse 3, when most everybody, they will take this verse as the sign of the end times. No, there are two things that Jesus was saying here. The sign of his coming into your heart, that this is good news, because Jesus is gonna come to the heart of the bride first before he comes at the end of the age. So now, when we see the current events, all the bad news, God is fast-tracking the demolishing of the bride, the heart of the bride, so that he can come. Not his second coming yet. So hindi pa si Jesus darating. Now most everybody will say, tomorrow can be the rapture. Cannot be, because if you look around, kompleto na ba yung bride? Ilan na ba yung bride na nakikita natin? Sabi nga ni Bambi, mabibilang mo lang, ilan na ba yung bride? God is going to prepare the bride before he comes, kasi he does not want the bride to go through judgment in hell. He wants the bride to have the judgment today when you are still alive. Where? In the first heaven of tabernacle number 4, when there is not one stone left in your heart upon another. So when you are going through tribulation, when you are going through affliction, isn't it time to be for thanksgiving and rejoicing? Because just as Jesus, when he was hanging on the cross, he says, who, for the joy that was set before him, he endured the shame, he endured the pain. Affliction is very painful. But if you focus on the joy that that Jesus is gonna come into your heart to make your heart his dwelling place, so that you are going to be so secure and have and experienced heaven on earth, where you are going to have peace that surpasses all understanding. You are going to have joy that this world can never understand. You are going to thank God for the affliction that you are going through right now. Okay? So when it's talking about the signs of the times, the first is the coming of Jesus in the heart of the bride before the end of the age will come. That is the true meaning of Matthew 24, verses 1 to 3. Most everybody will give this as the sign of the end. When you continue reading, Jesus says, when you hear of the wars and the rumors of wars, he says, it is not yet the end. Matagal pa yung end. Kasi minabanali lang ni Lord yung pagwawasak ng puso ng bride para ma-prepare yung bride to be for the coming of Jesus.